Hello and welcome back to Argyle Digital CMO Virtual. My name is Victoria Warwick with the Argyle Group. A couple of notes before I turn things over to our keynote speaker. First, a quick reminder to stop by our sponsor's virtual booth at any time during today's event and for the following week. Sponsor booths are accessible from the main agenda page for this event. To ask questions throughout the session, simply type into the Q&A chat and we will address your questions at the end of the session. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce today's speaker, Greg Silverman, Chief Executive Officer and Founder at Concentric. We are excited to have Greg for his thought leadership presentation titled, The Future of Brand, From Outcomes to Systems, A New Approach. Welcome, Greg. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Victoria. Good to be here with everybody today. I'm talking about the future of brand strategy, and the way I've organized the conversation today is just to highlight first some changes in what I think the brand landscape is, introduce kind of a new way of thinking about brand and how it relates to a whole bunch of different types of components in the ecosystem that you have to manage. Give you a case example of how this new approach plays out most recently during COVID times, and then just a quick hit on some steps you can take if you find this topic valuable and critical to you. So the first finding that I really thought was interesting, being a brand analytics person for over 20 years, is that the lifespan of a brand is collapsing. And there was a study done that said the brand's life has moved from 61 years to 18 years in just about 60 years. So you're really talking about 2 decades for a brand to live and have some expectations of the future. And I thought it was interesting. I saw an interesting set of articles about what's caused this kind of shortened life cycle. Certainly, private equity roll-ups make a big difference in a lot of industries. Mergers and acquisitions, we see a lot of activity recently on that. We've seen a lot of good IPOs about innovative unicorns that have done something to create brands and obviously erode some competitive set. We've also seen some startups that did not innovate, things like Quibi that launched but raised a couple $1 billion but couldn't get moving. There's a whole influence of word of mouth across the globe that really is starting to make a difference in what revenue you can expect. So we're really looking at a much turbulent world for brands. And I think one of the things that, we then ask ourselves, and what the theory is of this conversation is, what is the nature of brand strategy in the face of this turbulence? And I come from the world where there's really kind of 3 parts to brand management. First is governance, which we'll talk about just for a brief second. How we've managed brands historically as if they're complicated engineering problems. And then kind of this emergent science around complexity. What is the world of brands having to influence things beyond the marketplace? And we'll take a look at those. So first off, most of you probably have some kind of digital asset management system. You have brand guidelines, you have creative briefs. It is the heart and working center of all brands, and the only way you can start to execute and extend the strength of a brand anywhere in the marketplace. But many of us have been focused on what's the outcome of the franchise that our brand represents. I actually was someone who led the Interbrand report for a decade, ranking the top global brands. And what I recognized when we were pushing kind of the outcomes and how do you move up the rankings, we were missing something as the world became influenced by those disruptive properties we started the conversation with. We were really looking at protecting brands and their franchise as if it's a complicated problem, right? So much of marketing conversation is about how do you optimize your spend, and can I find a way to improve my spend to drive my sales? But promotion or ad spend is really one of many P's, 4 P's, 6 P's, 7 P's, however you think about marketing strategy. And what's emerging more and more because of the speed at which things happen is that there's a complex relationship of the brand to the consumer marketplace. So if you look at this slide and you say, okay, my brand has a strategy that influences consumer events. And that's anything along the path that communicates to a consumer. So that could be our advertising, be customer service, could be product experience. It could be PR and things that happen. It changes the way consumers make and perceive our brand. And it changes the way then the decisions they make and the likelihood that they're going to talk. So we now have this dynamic environment where the consumer becomes media, right? They start to influence things very quickly. And on top of that, the level of complexity that we're adding in terms of an analytic point of view and a strategy discipline is we're starting to be able to see, and therefore we want to be able possibly to quantify what the market's doing. So these all become interacting and interdependent variables that move around like, well, probably some of you are old enough to remember water beds. As you push on one side, the other side goes up and down. So there's this complexity that creates these emergent problems very quickly. So if we have these three components, how does the world look like for a brand manager and people trying to create brand strategy? Well, of course, governance will always be required. It's not something that is going to go away. But what happens now is that governance has to move across multiple parts of the business, right? Not only is it a marketing issue, but it's a product issue. It has to define things in the supply chain. And this is kind of a complicated problem, right? Complicated in the sense that no matter how many times you do it, you would always have a plan for what this looks like. But what we've seen recently is what I call kind of these societal analogs. What are the things that all of those business inputs have in terms of a relationship to society? So we have to be able to understand competitors, right? Boundaries in competition are far more permeable. People enter and leave marketplaces much faster. Consumers and the zeitgeist of what's acceptable and what isn't changes very, very quickly. As we've seen in the last 18 months, government can play a very big role, whether it be in tariffs, whether it be subsidies, whether it be bailouts. And of course, there's continuing pressure on the environment, right? There's just a limited number of resources in the world. So if you're starting to conceive a brand strategy that doesn't account for these societal analogs, you're probably having an incomplete picture. Now, the challenge really becomes how do we learn, right? Because when we think about brand strategy, and many of us, and I'm included, right, is saying, okay, I invested X, I want Y results. And that's an outcome. But oftentimes what's more important as that's occurring is the feedback loops on what I call kind of secondary learning. And the reason I think this is an urgent issue for most brands today is because of this piece of research, right? Almost 2/3 of consumers say that they will boycott a brand for its social positions. Now, to me, it doesn't matter what you think your social position should or shouldn't be, or what consumers think it should or shouldn't be. The fact is, it's starting to influence revenue. And if you're not accounting for those societal analogs as you build your brand strategy, you're at risk for being, I'll use the term canceled very quickly, because consumers say they will boycott you if you get out of line with their expectations. So how do you face this kind of world, right? There's a decision to make on which analogs to quantify in order to survive in the market, right? Part of what's accelerating the life cycle to be shorter for brands is a lot of people have missed those analogs over the last couple of decades, and more you'll have to figure out how to do it. And I think, the world is moving toward us where we will be able to create mathematical twins of our marketplace. So just like there's simulation games on your iPhone, or there's simulations about vaccine spreads, or there's simulations in product design, brand strategy will start moving toward these kind of simulation platforms that allow you to recreate all the competitors in your market, what they're doing in terms of spend, what they're doing in price, and start modeling out the way in which the world works, right? So what happens in this kind of dynamic, simulated environment is you really have like a full-time system that's going to give you feedback as you ask it questions. Some people have called it, and I like the term Alexa for the boardroom. Hey, we're facing a PR crisis. Our competitors drop their price. We're getting a new competitor. Our service changes. We adjust our spend. A distribution channel closes. And the entire dynamic of the marketplace, from experience to price to word of mouth, needs to be able to adapt and give foresight and optimization in terms of these changing market dynamics. So what we're seeing is the ability now to quantify the impact of those market forces, right? The things that we just talked about, maybe that PR crisis our brand is having is going to cost us some sales. Maybe a competitor tries to take advantage and their price increase works for our in favor. Maybe we do something that improves service. And getting this kind of market-driven forward forecast is really where brand strategy and the quantification of it are going to marry to create a whole new set of generation of tools, right? Right now, if you want to go from one place to the other, you might have Google Maps or Apple or Waze, and it's feeding you prescriptions on how to find these solutions. Well, these digital twins are going to create the same opportunity. It'll be able to evaluate all the things that you think you might want to do and also recommend things that you can't imagine, but they're possible combinations of the way in which you're crafting a brand strategy. So let's try and make this a little more concrete for the moment, right? So I guess it was last March or so, one of our customers works heavily in the alcohol industry and said, what's going to happen to sales? And of course, on-premise sales were going to drop because people couldn't go out. But the question became, for people like me who liked 2 martinis on a Friday night, what's going to happen when I'm sitting home and doing nothing? And I was talking to Victoria before the show and saying, hey, I now have a mirror at home and I do a lot more yoga and working out. Well, this do nothing is a form of that kind of zeitgeist of a consumer change, environmental change, government regulations. And all of a sudden, the industry was facing quarter over quarter an $80 billion short-term loss of potential revenue. Now, that insight was contradictory to what people were hearing when things shut down, right? Because revenue and sales for alcohol for in-home went up very quickly, and I think it stayed pretty high. But the on-premise loss was really deteriorating a whole new category of business. So this same brand said, okay, well, if this is about to happen, what can we forecast in terms of new groups where there may be pent-up demand? And you can see here on the chart just month by month for one of their segments. They called it Let Loose and Lively. I think they're all down here in Florida now having spring break. The younger segments were going to go out first. And so they started looking at their brands and saying, okay, how can we compensate for that lack of on-premise distribution by targeting these segments who are going to go out and do things early? And that's a great way to pick up market share. So there is all in the forward-looking view. It's all about optimizing what's going on, what's possible to go on, the what-if strategy. And ultimately, they could look at other competitors that could come in, right? So they said, well, we see now cannabis drinks are coming in as an alternative and kind of an alternative form of relaxation for these do-nothing. So there's a lot of foresight, competitive gaming that it gives them some opportunities to create new brand strategies, new pricing, new promotions, new messaging. And that's really, I think, where brands are going to be going as these, the pandemic hit us all, it hit us all at the same time, but there'll be other forms of societal disruption, and having a sensibility about what those do and how they impact things really, I think, is the future where brand strategy goes. So I didn't want to leave you with just an idea. I thought, what have I seen other CMOs and senior analytics folks do to create kind of this move toward an ESG point of view about brand management? I think first is the risk concept. 2/3 of your revenue could be up for grabs for decisions you may not even be aware you're making, or outcomes that you may not even be aware that could emerge. So I think amongst your senior management team that can influence brand strategy, take a hard look at is that a risk we're willing to live with, or is it a risk that we want to try and minimize by building a business case for accepting it as a possibility? I often use on the second bullet this term kind of like a project charter, or something that says, hey, here's what we're agreeing to do, right? Because these brand strategy projects and the things that quantify brand really aren't one-offs, and they're really not short-term. So you want to be able to say, hey, here's what we're trying to do and track and keep that charter so that months and quarters down the road where there might be a regime change or a priority change in the business, you can at least take it back out and say, look, hey, this is what we agreed to. We said it might be a 12, 24, 36-month process to do a pilot. And it helps people keep the alignment so that you can get to the point where you can at least see what your current strategy is doing and how can you start accounting for those societal analogs, right? New competition or barriers that break down the consumer, government intervention, and environmental issues. I think the big challenge is, prove that it can be done, that you can at least see it and maybe actually get an understanding of it. And then once you have that, you really have what I call the numerator over a denominator of investment that give you a business case for moving forward. So that's just kind of a quick run through on the concept that we have. I know I'm in between me and I think a panel follows, but I left a few minutes for some questions. And Victoria, I'll just turn it back to you to see what's come in.
Excellent. Greg, thank you so much for that really insightful presentation. We had a few questions come in. So first off, considering brands that you've relied on, traditional marketing in the past, how has the pandemic shifted those practices to be more modern or digital?
Yeah, I think what people really stress tested when the pandemic hit was whether or not their systems were able to account for disruption. And so I think some people had systems and analytics and strategy information flows that were very comfortable in the face of massive disruption. I think the majority were not. And what people have had to do is go back and say, how much of this uncertainty and extension of our view to the broader ecosystem are we willing to take on? And some people plowed into that with quick investments. Largely, either they were in areas where the business was really suffering or areas where business was really doing very well. So it's the folks kind of in the middle who are a bit undecided, who I think stayed where they were because they were, obviously managing to survive during the pandemic.
That's a great point. So how do you identify relevant strategies or developments that could positively impact an organization and its customers?
Yeah, I think where we're seeing the most activity, obviously, generally everybody has some form of segmentation. But what we're seeing is in the primary research areas, people are starting to ask their customers to rate certain types of issues tied to their purchase. So I think the first thing that has to happen is you have to discover what are the issues that 64% are worried about. I saw some research the other day that 90% of millennials want to tailor their investing strategy to their preferences on social issues. So if you're devising a financial trading platform, you're going to have to really build in some kind of customization so that the stocks match value. So I think it's understanding what people want that are part of your segments, finding out who the heavy users are and what their highest concerns are socially, and then starting to address those either through messaging or product decisions or sourcing and environmental decisions that are consistent with their beliefs, and being able to turn that commitment to them back to the rest of the organization to say, and it's worth this much revenue. It's worth this much money to us. Because I don't think you can do it just for social purpose. I think you have to do it by tying it to financial returns for the organization.
No, that's excellent to consider. I apologize. I believe we have some parking interference. What recommendations can be made for a brand that was devastated by the global pandemic and is in recovery mode at this time?
Could you just say that again? I lost a little bit of it with the background noise. I'm sorry.
I apologize. What recommendations can be made for a brand that was devastated by the global pandemic and is in recovery mode?
Yeah, I'm loath to say that there's some general recommendations on what to do. I think more in terms of process than action. So the process that I would start to look at would be going back to that kind of core customer group that may have been disconnected or is just loosely connected because you maybe can't service them. And I think understanding what are the conditions from which they will come back to the brand, or maybe even for some places, come back to the category, right? So it may not be, how do I get people to come back to my brand, but how do I get them to come back to the category? And you would certainly see that in things like travel and cruising and maybe, park attendance. So I think you have to understand, is that category coming back, and are people coming back to you after that, and see if there's some way to remove barriers that might be safety or income, unavailability, and kind of really look at that connective tissue between your objective for sales and what's the customer experience that they need to re-engage in the category.
No, excellent. And so you talked a little bit about tracking results of specific brand strategies. So what are some best practices to consider, or what are some key components that might be the most important to track in your strategy?
Yeah, I think most of the time the folks I see have some mission critical, brand metrics, whether it be perceptions or brand health, however you consider it. Obviously, people are looking at sales. But we've probably seen the most volatility, and the thing to start looking at would be, rethink your social listening and try and go one layer deep in terms of, instead of just maybe volume of social listening and how many conversations, but can you find the sentiments in there, right? So there's some natural language processing tools, some coding tools that would say maybe we have positive, neutral, and negative. And can you start to see those by lifetime value of segment? And I think those are early warning clues for brand strategists, CMOs who are looking to say, hey, maybe I can't invest in this, or I want to start tracking it. I think looking at the social listening and the sentiment valence of each one of those perspectives from each group give you some early warnings that allow you to adjust and take action if things start to become negative and slip away from positive brand, acceptance.
And just have one more question for you, Greg. So obviously there's been a lot of disruption this year. So what are some of the learnings that you've identified from just kind of adapting to change, and how can leaders build more resilience to come out stronger as a marketer moving forward?
Yeah, I think one of the hardest things, because of quarterly pressures and financial pressures, is to create space in the organization for learning, right? All of us are very well attuned for hitting quarterly or monthly numbers and any kind of productivity goal. But for resilience to occur, there has to be some room for learning and experimenting. And lobbying for that as part of a job description or compensation plan is really, I think, where leadership has to step in and say, look, I've got to have some kind of opportunity, some loon shot of opportunity to try something new, try something different, and carve out some space and time to start learning on the edges of these kind of complex emergent phenomena, or we'll never catch up to them. And I think it's small insurance to get a big long-term result.